All right, hello everybody. This is Eric Bolesh here from Cutting Edge Information. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar on the development and deployment of rate cards. I am the Chief Operating Officer here at Cutting Edge Information, and I am joined by Jacob Presson, who works with our data and is a manager in our F&B services. And we're both really excited to share our findings with you today. Before we jump into things, I want to cover some housekeeping points. First of all, we're really excited to partner with University Conference Services to stage this webinar. They're expert event organizers, and so we're all benefiting from their expertise. The slides will be available afterward. We'll email them to you directly, so you don't need to worry about that. And the presentation itself will actually be available on our YouTube channel as well. As far as the interface here on your screens, you'll see a Q&A pane down at the bottom of the screen, and that's your primary way to interact with us. Nothing you type there is going to be seen by the larger audience, so it's a direct conduit to those of us on this side of things. If you have any questions, please let us know, and we'll address them either in process or at the end of things. And even if we don't have time for every single question, we'll be able to follow up with you directly after the webinar itself. And lastly, if you're having any technical issues, trouble with audio, that sort of thing, please let us know there in that pane, and our webinar producers should be able to help you out. In a worst case scenario, you can reply to the reminder emails you've gotten about the webinar itself, and you'll be able to get in touch with somebody. Okay. A little bit more about us. Jacob and I have both been here for a number of years, and we've spent our careers at Cutting Edge Information developing research that delivers real-world findings to our clients. So this is data that comes out of the field and comes out of the industry, and that's what we'll be doing with you all today. The agenda itself focused on rate cards in three different parts. First of all, we're going to take a look at what goes into the design of the rate cards themselves. Then we'll identify some of the trends that we've been seeing over the last few years. And then the second half of the webinar will be spent breaking down actual examples of the rate cards or some rate cards themselves. And so that should be pretty interesting because these are things that we see in action in the field. We're focused on this topic as a whole because our main product, of course, is fair market value rates. So we develop hourly rates for HCPs and non-HCPs around the globe. But of course, when we're doing that, we encounter rate cards all the time, and we get a lot of questions on it. We see a lot of different approaches, and we know that folks out there are trying to improve what they have, and they're curious about how other organizations are handling things. A little bit about us. We were founded almost 20 years ago, and we spent that time developing information products for the life sciences, different sectors of the industry, so pharma, biotech, medical devices. As I mentioned a moment ago, our focus now is on fair market value, and we first started publishing research in this area more than 10 years ago when it really started to emerge as a topic. Our flagship product is called F&B Connect, and that's an annual database that covers nearly 300 different types of healthcare providers and non-medical personnel in markets around the globe. I know we're up over 130 different markets now. But in the course of doing all that work, we get exposed to connected areas of compliance and HCP relationship management. And so this year we decided to publish research and to speak on several of these different areas. We covered travel policy back in March, and some of you may have attended that webinar. Other topics we're covering include things like exceptions processes and HCP tiering. We call all of this additional research the Compliance Companion because that's really what it is. It's a companion to our F&B rate data. And today, of course, we're going to be covering rate card elements. So one last slide here on methodology so you understand where all of this rate card knowledge is coming from. Every year we run a survey and we collect actual rate cards to build our F&B database. In the building of the database right now, we have more than 120,000 different points of rate data. So these are payments that we've seen in the field. And we also have a number of rate cards. So we've collected rate cards from more than 80 different organizations across biopharma and medical technology. We also encounter rate cards on the deployment side. So as we're working with clients and feeding our rates into their systems, we see how they're doing things, and we get a sense of how they're approaching this whole issue in the first place. So that mix of factors is what we've used to build the findings that we're sharing with you today. All right, let's jump in. So the first of our topics, we're looking at factors that come up for consideration in rate card design. So in short, what are people thinking about when they build these things? And at this point, I'm going to hand the mic over to Jacob, and he and I are going to go back and forth through the remainder of the webinar as we walk through the findings. Jacob.
Thanks so much, Eric. So what I really wanted to do is start off our discussion with one of the fundamental choices driving rate card design. Do you, A, choose a process-heavy approach that really closely manages and documents the entire HCP engagement process from start to finish, or do you focus mainly on the raw data and then supply process instructions separately, either through a seminar or through separate documentation? So I highlight this because this early choice has a ripple effect on deployment. You know, those process-heavy rate cards might need to be adopted as a template in each market, since they're going to have to be tailored to the individual country or business unit. Whereas a more pure data dump can be distributed globally without modifications, and I'll actually show some examples of these in a little bit so that way you really understand what I'm talking about. But while I'm looking at these broad themes, I want to show that while what I have here isn't universally applicable, our analysis has shown that single market focused rate cards are going to be more often used by small companies, whereas large companies with extensive operations, they appear to more frequently deploy a single card that has a more narrow focus on the raw rates themselves.
And just on that point, Jacob, I want to clarify, it's not as though the large companies or the large data dump rate cards are not focused on individual markets. They are. It's just that they're built differently.
Absolutely. So the reason we see those large companies adopting an approach that focuses on the rates themselves, it honestly comes down a lot of the time to scalability, and we'll show a couple of examples of that in a little bit. We do see some large companies with very hands-on global compliance teams who do get very involved in the nitty-gritty and produce more process and policy-focused rate cards on the country level.
Okay.
So there's certainly exceptions there.
Great, thanks. All right, so at this point, I'll jump in with the first of our two polls today. And the question we have here is, how are your rate cards currently designed? And we have some options there. Is it a single rate card for all global operations, so what Jacob was just talking about, pretty high level? Are business units given a template that they then adjust locally? Or that third option, are rate cards designed from the ground up by each individual business unit? And of course, maybe you don't have a rate card, or you don't know, and there's no shame in that. So we'll wait a minute here to see what kind of responses come in. All right, Jacob. Well, interesting numbers. Okay.
So it's actually really interesting watching these come in. It looked like some of the early responses showed an emphasis on those individual business units kind of taking ownership of the rate card design process. But actually, looking at what's in the lead right now, it looks like a lot of teams are adopting a single rate card for all of their global operations, and then a similar number who are actually kind of working off of a standardized template. And we'll actually explore a couple of those options. And then actually for those of you who don't currently have a rate card, there could be a lot of reasons for that, but if potentially you're listening in today for some ideas, we'll hopefully be able to give you some good insights here in a little bit.
Yeah, and of course the attendance, the demographics of our the webinar attendance here is going to affect what kind of answers
Absolutely.
we're getting. That I know for these webinars, we tend to get people who are pretty savvy around FMV and rate cards in general. So it's interesting to see what this group comes back with. Okay. Let's get into the second section here. This is the trends we're seeing in the design of the rate cards themselves, and there are quite a few topics to talk about here. But the basic question is what goes into these things, or what goes on the rate cards in the first place. And we'll look specifically at the inclusion of components like instructions or clear definitions, and we'll also look at approaches to compensation, because that dictates how the rates themselves will appear on the rate cards in the end.
And, another way to kind of frame what Eric is talking about there is that what we're looking at is how your early design choices will show up in these total rate cards and kind of, again, looking at that ripple effect. So just kind of some high-level stats here. Of the cards that we've reviewed, around 38% include detailed process instructions in the style that we might expect from those very policy-oriented rate cards that we discussed earlier. However, over time, we have seen more companies adopt rate cards that don't really have that same emphasis on the process within the rate card itself. Now, our best explanation for that trend is that as teams become more comfortable with the processes that are covered, they might be instead covered through those annual compliance meetings or through webinars, kind of like this one that may be done internally within an organization. So later in this presentation, if you do decide you want to include these detailed instructions, you can certainly do those, and we'll have some examples of that later on. Now, one of the other things we were interested in assessing was the presence, or lack thereof, of definitions for terms like tiers or event duration or other kinds of travel assumptions. And here we actually see a pretty even split between cards that define these terms explicitly and those that don't. So one of the most important things to communicate clear definitions for is the underlying assumption for activity duration. And this is particularly true for rate cards that present rates as a flat fee instead of just a base hourly rate. Now, whether you have a flat fee amount whenever you have a flat fee amount in your rate card, it's really important that end users understand the number of hours of work, and that's either an activity or prep or in some case in travel, that are going to be built into that rate. So for example, if you have a rate card that shows an FMV of $1,500 for a speaking engagement, you'll want to specify that maybe the flat fee assumes 3 hours of prep and 1 hour for the speech itself. And it's very important that that's clearly documented in the rate card itself, so that way it's front and center for all of your end users. Now, one interesting trend that we've seen in regards to these definitions is that they are disappearing from rate cards over the past few years. We've seen a declining number of cards detailing these terms, and this actually does kind of go hand in hand with a decrease in the amount of rate cards that have flat fees. So based on what we were talking about earlier, there may be a connection there. So as you can see here in the 2013 to 14 time frame, around 3/4 of rate cards had detailed definitions. That's compared with less than half in our most recent round of collection. So this is another indication of increasing familiarity with the processes and terminology surrounding FMV rates. But it is important, like I said earlier, if you do have those flat fees or really anything in the rate card that has underlying assumptions, that you take the time to detail all of those assumptions in the rate card itself. Now, we've already touched a little bit on this, but I do want to look at the next design choice that you may consider when designing a rate card, which is the structure of the recommended payment amount. So was an hourly rate given, and then the end users are expected to multiply this by however many hours are involved in the engagement? Or is there just a flat fee provided that factors in activity time and prep and travel and all those things we mentioned? So for example, when determining compensation for a speaker program, does the rate card provide an hourly rate or a total amount for the entire engagement? So historically, most cards provided flat fee amounts based on the activity, but today's rate cards tend to focus on hourly rates, or at least provide hourly rates as a backup in case an HCP might be engaged for an activity that falls outside of the scope of the rate card's flat fees. So looking at the data here, just 10% of the rate cards we reviewed exclusively provide flat fees. And, you know, we do see, like I mentioned, there's a large number of rate cards, 46%, that do provide both a flat fee and an hourly rate. And that's a nice way to make sure that your end users have all the information at their fingertips that they might need to make a decision. And like I said, this shift towards hourly rates is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. So from 2013 to last year, the percentage of rate cards showing hourly rates went from 25% to 58%. And the driving force behind this is a desire for increased flexibility and also really to minimize the possibility that those end users encounter a scenario for which the rate card may provide no guidance. And so really showing a clear hourly rate can help disambiguate any underlying assumptions that may have produced flat fee compensation amounts. So those hourly rates are useful almost regardless of the other design choices that you've made for the rate card. Now, looking at another design choice, we want to see whether companies publish a single rate with each tier or activity or provide a range of acceptable rates. And what I mean by this is the recommended compensation, for example, $300, or is it $250 to $350? And this actually does have a pretty big impact on end users. And as you can see here, the majority of rate cards we have analyzed provide just a single number. And really, in our opinion, and this is also based on conversations that we've had with industry leaders, the best choice really appears to be a single number. Otherwise, end users might go through that whole tiering process and identifying the right category for an HCP, and then still find some ambiguity in what represents an acceptable compensation amount. And obviously, ambiguity is the last thing that you want to introduce into your compliance process. Now, I can kind of hear those of you who maybe have seen CEI's data, and you might be thinking, well, hang on, you guys provide a range of acceptable rates, and we do. We provide data from the 25th to the 75th percentile, but I do want to clarify that what I'm talking about in these slides are the rate cards that are being published to end users. And so, you know, while we do provide you with a range, what we're really looking for are teams to decide on a single rate that perfectly matches their risk tolerance. Now, I can also hear an argument that says that putting ranges on rate cards can provide much needed flexibility on the ground, and that's totally fair. But kind of in the theme of this presentation, I do want to show a little card trick that highlights an alternate approach. So as you see here, both clubs and diamonds have a rate of 8. That rate is what's being published to their end users on the ground. But let's say a request comes in to compensate at a higher level, so 9, for example. Well, so diamonds have actually predetermined internally that their risk tolerance allows for up to 10. And so it's kind of a secret range that the compliance team can have decided on up front, but it allows them to still publish a single number that offers clear guidance to those end users while keeping that certain amount of flexibility and making sure, of course, that all these payment amounts are still compliant.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jacob. So we're through 2 of our 3 sections now, getting a sense of what influences rate card construction, looking at some of these components. Now, for the remainder of the webinar, we'll look at some live examples. We're going to walk through 4 fairly different types of rate cards, and these are archetypes. They combine some different components that we commonly see in rate cards. So it's not as though you're going to see any specific company names, but they're true-to-life examples of what we're seeing used in the field every day. And before we move on, I do want to remind folks there are some questions coming in, some comments. Don't hesitate to use the Q&A pane at the bottom, especially as we go through this section, because we'll get into some fairly detailed stuff. So if you have any questions or you want further clarification, don't hesitate to go ahead and let us know. And on that note, we'll jump into the second poll before we look at the templates themselves. Second question of the day, it focuses on how rate cards are developed. So is it completely internally? Is it internally, but with the assistance of a third party? Has rate card development been handed over to a third party? Or again, is there no rate card, or maybe you don't know how it was developed? So we'll take a moment here and we'll see how these numbers come in. There seems to be a pretty strong trend.
Yeah, so, and I think what we're seeing here with this kind of wavering mid-50s to 60% of rate cards are being developed with the assistance of a third party, and a lot of that really just kind of reflects a certain degree of uncertainty, because obviously the rate card that you put out there, it carries a lot of importance, because that is kind of the standard by which you are setting all of how all of these end users are going to determine compensation amounts. And so it's really important that a lot of thought is put into it. And then certainly we have seen some cases where the rate card is developed entirely by the third party. This can be difficult to navigate, certainly, because you'll want the rate card to reflect your own business practices, your own specific circumstances, but we have seen it done, and actually done successfully in some cases. And then certainly we see this a lot, particularly with local business units who may be kind of making their own path in terms of rate cards where they are developed internally. This is where we do, to be transparent, we do see some kind of suboptimal rate card designs come out because they are being designed in a vacuum. And so hopefully this next section will highlight some good best practices to follow to hopefully avoid some of those mistakes. And so with that being said, I'm just going to dive right in. And so this rate card is really prototypical of that raw data approach. This is a rate card that kind of very loosely defines the titles and the countries, and then focuses on providing the numbers themselves. And the main emphasis for this rate card is scale. This is a single rate card that can be dropped throughout a region or even globally. There's really minimal text, and it has a very streamlined focus on the numbers themselves. And these are all provided as hourly rates, so it comes with a lot of flexibility in the deployment as well. So obviously you have the top row that shows the titles to which each rate applies. Each row is going to be a single country or market. And then here you see the emphasis on the plain hourly rates. And that does come with a drawback. You know, there's very limited information outside of just the compensation amounts. And that's, again, a design choice that certainly can be valid. So really why I wanted to show this is that it highlights the best practice of just providing a single rate within each cell. There's not a range of acceptable rates. And in addition to that, you know, kind of looking at the overall pros and cons of this approach, the scalability can be a real asset, and that's in addition to the ease of deployment. But on the downside, with this approach, you don't get a lot of market-level specificity when it comes to local policies like rate caps or the limitations on travel compensation. And then also just on a practical level, you are really limited in terms of the number of titles you can include, just before you run out of columns or it becomes so unwieldy that it's not very usable for your teams on the ground. Now, as we discussed at the start of this presentation, this is an approach that we see a lot of large companies taking. And like we mentioned, that's largely down to the ease of rolling this out on a large scale and in a single push, because you're not really tailoring much on a country level. And so For companies that maybe want to set the rates themselves on a global level, but leave the nuts and bolts of policy making on travel, on activity duration, this is going to be a good approach for teams who are in that scenario. Now, what we have in this rate card are flat fees for a single activity, and then we have a couple of modifiers for different roles. Before I dive into this, I want to make sure to emphasize that all of the examples and the numbers and titles and everything here are shown for the purpose of discussion only. The rates here aren't necessarily a recommendation of fair market value. The table itself doesn't necessarily contain every single component that a good rate card should have. So what I'm really hoping to accomplish here is just to communicate some basic ideas and practices and concepts around rate card design rather than provide you with a complete actionable template. And so with that being said, I just want to quickly walk through what we have in this rate card, which is a clear emphasis on a single activity, and then presumably the whole rate card would have other tables that would account for other activities depending on their engagement practices. The rows correspond to a specific type of specialist with whom they frequently engage. And then finally, we see that the tiers and activity duration are identified in the column headers. So just if I put our focus here on the half-day advisory board, for example, we see that the rates are shown as flat fees for each tier and title. And this brings me to what I believe is the best practice shown in this rate card. And that's the use of a nifty little modifier for the role. That's something that's easy for end users to apply, and it's also intuitively consistent. So, for example, a presenter may have done extra preparation for which they should be compensated, certainly. But that single presentation shouldn't really be reflected as an increase in the hourly rate. They're only doing extra work for a certain amount of time during the course of the entire advisory board. And so, you know, if I look at the sample table we have here, an oncology presenter at a half-day advisory board, let's call them tier 2, they would have a rate for the advisory board of $1,650, and then they would get a presenter modifier of $175. And so you can see that it's easy to walk through. Now, again, looking at the pros and cons of this example that we presented, we do see that it's got some nice details. It's appropriately process-oriented in how it walks the end users through identifying the total compensation amount. But unfortunately, its drawbacks are that it is inflexible and a bit restrictive because unless you have a completely exhaustive list of activities here, you run the risk of end users encountering a scenario for which the rate card does not provide guidance. And then also, and this is where defining those assumptions becomes clear, there could be confusion if an advisory board is being arranged that doesn't match up directly with those assumptions. So, for example, if the assumption in this rate card was that a full-day advisory board is 8 hours, but circumstances dictate that you want to put on a 10-hour advisory board, the rate card doesn't have the flexibility to adapt to that. And of course, that's obviously suboptimal. And then finally, because there aren't any hourly rates shown here, it is somewhat opaque in terms of how the final rates have been derived, and certainly transparency seems to be the big buzzword of the day across the spectrum of managing HCP engagements. So if the weakness of the previous example is that it wasn't terribly clear on how rates are derived, this example potentially overcompensates. You can see that we have a lot going on here, and I'll try to walk through this. But what it is it's extremely process-oriented in how it tries to resolve that issue. So we're first introduced to a very bare-bones tiering chart. and then given a reference table for calculating the travel compensation amount. And then I actually want to spend a little bit of time on this third table, and I know it's a lot of text in there, so I'll walk through it a little bit. What this is it's a compensation modifier for any unique characteristics of an HCP that might fall outside of your tiering guidance. And so again, the list provided here is shown in an example, but you could certainly tailor it to your needs. And so if I go here, I see that if a potential stakeholder is board certified and a department chief and has extensive speaking experience, they would have 3 points, so to speak. And that would warrant an extra $200 in compensation. And certainly that list can be tailored to match either the types of HCPs with whom you frequently engage, or just whatever qualifications aren't inherently accounted for in your tiering criteria. And then the last table shows us how to bring all of these disparate pieces together. And the rates presented are flat fees, but the final amounts are customized to the engagement and the HCP. So you have the flat fee for a given activity duration, and then you add in the travel fee, and then that little modifier that we talked about earlier. And the inclusion of that little modifier is actually a very nice touch. So as with the other cards, we'll take a look at a quick pro and con list here. Really, this is very process-oriented. It's kind of a nice step-by-step. Internally, we've referred to this as a calculator type rate card, and it does provide a clear route to derive that final rate. But as you saw from the tiering and also just from the sheer scope of the rate card, this would really only work if you're a small organization that only engages with a small list of HCP types. And so, excuse me. And so really, if you're going to be engaging with a large variety of HCPs, that's something that you may want to consider and potentially look at other rate card examples. So this rate card is actually focused on distilling a large number of titles into a simple and easy to reference table. So if the previous rate card was mainly focused or best suited for companies that have a small number of HCPs, this rate card is going to be well suited for companies that engage with a large range of HCPs. So the example that we have here just shows 8 titles and 4 groups. But, you know, we've seen examples of this approach where the number of titles can easily go over 100, and the number of groups that you kind of define with this approach can range from 4 to 6 or more. So again, this is just for example purposes. And so if you look here, let's take a hospitalist, for example, from this table. You would look for the rates associated with group 3. And then once you have identified the HCP's group, you go to that second table. And there you can find ranges of hourly rates for the relevant tier. And so in this scenario, if our hypothetical hospitalist is in tier 1, they would be paid between $400 to $600. And I'll be the first to admit, providing a range of rates, it does actually go against our recommendation to provide a single rate. However, in this case, the range might actually be justified simply because the guidance isn't just for a single title, but for a group of titles. And this does provide some undesirable ambiguity, which we already discussed trying to avoid, but it is a natural consequence of the design. So certainly that's another thing to take into account where in terms of trying to find a design that best suits your individual needs. And then one last time, we'll take a look at the pro-con list for this. And really the key strength of this rate card is that it distills a large amount of information into a single table. On the con side, we already talked a little bit about the ranges, and then additionally, in some cases, the process might be a little difficult to follow.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Jacob. That brings us to the end of our slides today. Thanks, everyone, for sticking with us. We will address the questions that have been coming in, but first, a little more housekeeping. Our contact information is up there on the right-hand side. If you'd like to follow up with either of us individually, we'd be happy to hear from you. And as you see on the left-hand side, we're in the midst of a busy 2019. Our 2019 FMV rate data is available, and it's currently being deployed around the world, so we're getting some feedback on that. And of course, we're publishing this set of compliance companion research pieces with all of the different components. So there's a lot going on. We really strive to be extraordinarily responsive to feedback and to client requests. So if there's any areas you'd like to see us cover, or if you have any questions about anything, we'd love to hear about it, and we'd love to get into a conversation with you. A last point before we get to the questions is we're taking some time away from these webinars and the compliance companions for the summer. We'll be back in the fall, and what's on deck is a look at exceptions processes, which we see a lot and which we get a lot of questions on. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the questions. One of the earlier ones that came in is pharma any different from devices? So are drugs any different from technology?
Yeah, and this is a question that we get a lot. Based on the rate cards that we looked at, there really isn't much differentiation. Certainly, the particulars of the regulations that might apply do vary a little bit, but at the end of the day, the primary thing that these rate cards are trying to accomplish is just communicating appropriate compensation amounts to an external stakeholder. And that key question is fundamental regardless of whether or not you are a pharma company or a medical device company.
Okay. How about rate caps? Somebody's asking about rate caps, and how do the rate cards account for things that may change on a market-by-market basis?
So we do see a couple of different approaches here. We've even seen, especially in some of those raw data dumps, where there isn't much room to explicitly detail local policies, even some color coding of cells, just to make sure end users are aware that, hey, this is a rate that we have had to enforce a rate cap on. But as some of these rate caps get more nuanced, we know that, for example, South Korea has a daily rate cap. That doesn't necessarily affect the hourly rate. That's where we see some benefit to some of these rate cards that allow for a little bit more room to provide detail on the country level. And so, again, it's all about those choices that you make in the design. They're going to affect how you're able to detail these processes and how you end up communicating them to the end users.
Okay. We have a question. The question asker is coming from the compliance perspective, and they say in order to prevent a conflict of interest, medical affairs does the HCP tiering. Is that typical? Are there other considerations? What's our take on that?
Absolutely. So certainly the idea to have a separate function or even a vendor do the tiering to avoid a conflict of interest is certainly typical. I don't know if it's required or recommended per se, but in terms of a good practice to kind of, like the questioner said, to avoid that conflict of interest, it certainly makes sense. And as long as you can be sure that the medical affairs team is applying a consistent set of guidelines and a consistent approach to how they tier, then that seems like a healthy approach.
Okay. Now let's see here. Do we encounter rate cards that still leave ambiguity? So do we encounter any cards that in the end, you know, they may have the numbers, but they're not necessarily crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's?
I mean, I wish I could say otherwise, but of course, in the course of reviewing all of these rate cards, we did see some, unfortunately, bad examples that really didn't do a good job of communicating all of the necessary details, and as a result left a lot of ambiguity. The examples that we highlighted today, while certainly some of them may not suit everybody's individual needs, hopefully for some of them spoke to you in a way that maybe that approach will be useful. So there isn't really ever going to be a one-size-fits-all. Each of the cards we discussed has pros and cons, and it's about understanding what's going to be the best fit for your organization.
Okay. And we'll get to one more question. And the question is, who runs the rate card process? So if I interpret that, I'm going to say, who internally, what function or what positions are mainly responsible for developing and deploying the rate card?
That's another thing that's going to depend a lot on the individual company. We do see that large companies tend to have really involved global compliance teams, and that's where we see this kind of top-down approach, either from a single data-focused rate card that just kind of dumps all the data into individual countries' laps, or whether they're setting a template for the individual teams to follow. So I will say that typically compliance has ownership of this process. Smaller companies where there's compliance and medical affairs may have a lot of overlap. You might see medical affairs take ownership of this, since it's often the MSLs who are kind of the front line engaging with these HCPs. But I would say over time we're seeing a larger shift towards compliance.
Okay, great. All right, well, we'll cut off the questions there. I know there are some more, and we can get to them. And again, our folks will follow up with you directly if your question hasn't been answered here today. But in closing, just wanted to say thank you to everyone. If you do have any questions, please contact us. We'd be happy to talk with you. Enjoy your summers, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.